Good morning and welcome to Enter the Terminal, episode 11, where we are going to talk about networking. My name is Eric the IT Guy Hendricks, and joining me every episode is my friend and colleague, Scott McBrien.
Hello, everyone.
So I've noticed that the only time that a system doesn't misbehave is when you're watching it to see it misbehave. So thank you for bearing with us as we looked into a streaming issue this morning that didn't happen, but we should be good. We should be live. So with that said, let's go in and see what the root of this problem may be, and let's look into networking.
Right on. So this morning, just to kind of set where we are, we have our friendly neighborhood virtual machine here that has a second network interface, like an adapter, but it is not at all configured. So we're going to use the nmcli command to take a look at it and then figure out how to set some settings on it. So Eric, where would you like us to start?
Well, first thing to do is to level set and see what devices we have and what the device names are. So we'll use the nmcli, that's Network Manager Command Line Interface, and we want to do a connection show. And what that'll do is that'll show all the connections on our system. So the ENP0S3 device is our primary Ethernet port. This is a virtual machine, but if you think about the back of a physical server, this would be where the RJ45 cable actually gets plugged in. And then we have a virtual machine bridge, VIR BR0. We're not so much concerned about that one today. We'll save that for another day. But when you get multiple NICs going, when you have more complicated connections, like you want to connect several physical ports into one logical port, you can do some interesting thing with bridges. And in fact, before Eighth Doctor has a chance to hop in and correct us, I want to mention that all the nmcli commands are actually, you can actually shorten them. So if we did like an nmcli con, that would give us the same output. So nmcli connection gives us the same out. It defaults to the show option. So nmcli con or connection shows us the same thing as nmcli connection show. One other thing before we move on is that nmcli is also bash completion aware. So if you start to type in an nmcli command and you get lost at which point you are in the syntax, you can just hit tab and it will show you possible options. So nmcli, great command line tool. It's really intuitive. So now that we see our two connections, let's see what actual devices we have on this. So that would be an nmcli device show. Thank you. English and speaking hard, especially at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. So we mentioned we've got a few. We've got two NIC cards on here. So I will also mention that there is an LO, which is a local loopback connection. We'll talk more about that in a future episode. But also we have an ENP0S8 that is currently marked as disconnected. In the physical world, this would mean that either the device isn't plugged into a live Ethernet cable, or I agree, not enough caffeine this morning. But so it either means that this device isn't connected to a live connection, or in our case, is not configured. So I was actually going to suggest we bring a connection down and bring it back up, but considering we only have one live connection at the moment, maybe we circle back to that, because if we were to bring our Ethernet connection down at this point, we lose connection to our virtual machine. So let's hold off on that one. I didn't think that through when we set up the show notes. Scott, anything you want to mention about nmcli before we dive in a little bit deeper?
No, I think this is good. I think in the deeper dive, we're going to talk about actually configuring that extra interface, and we'll go through some of the steps along with that.
One other thing that just came to mind was what about IP addresses? Because while we can interact with the NIC card on this box by its device name, the ENP yada yada, when we're talking outside the system, we'd either want to be able to use a host name or an IP address. So how would we go about looking up the IP address of this particular box?
Good question. So we'll cover looking at that with nmcli in our deeper dive. But Eric, I think you're hinting at another command that's probably fairly critical, which is IP. So we can also do an IP adder show. And this is a command that kind of crosses over Linuxes as well. And it shows all the configured interfaces on your system. And you can see that it lists things like our EMP0S8 here that we are going to configure in our deeper dive. But then also it reports for EMPS0S3. It gives us its IP and network information as part of the IP adder show output.
So in some situations, we could use ping or another command to actually connect to that IP address. And then if we actually created, say, a host entry or a a DNS address, for that IP address, we could actually interact with our local virtual machine from other machines. So things like our SSH episode come to mind. But with that said, why don't we get a second NIC card configured here? All right. So we have nmcli. We know what devices we have, and we know that we have a second NIC card that isn't currently configured. So let's go ahead and start configuring 0S8. So to do that, we can actually use the nmcli command. I'm going to stumble over that all day, I can tell. And we're going to do a connection or a con if we want to use shorthand. We can use add and then the connection name. So in this case, we want to use the ENP0S8 network connection or the network device, and then IF name, which is interface name. And we'll go ahead and keep the device name and the interface name the same. You can rename these. There might be some use cases where you might want that a little bit more human readable. And then this is actually an Ethernet connection. And at any point in that command, we could actually use the tab key to give us some hints as to what the nmcli command is actually looking for. But if we hit enter here, it's actually going to set up that device, and either no news is good news, or some commands like nmcli actually say, hey, this works, congratulations. So if we do an nmcli device, we should see that we should see a little bit more connection information. So right now it is getting IP configuration. By default, unless we specify otherwise, it's actually going to, we actually have to wait for a DHCP address, but so it defaults to DHCP. But if we manually suggested a static address, which we'll get into here in just a minute, we'd actually have to specify some additional configuration information. So why don't we check in on our nmcli connection, and so it's still yellow here.
Yeah, and I actually expect this to not turn green, Eric, because I've not got the virtual interface on this virtual machine plumbed correctly. As you know, we use VirtualBox because it's readily available, but unfortunately, I don't have a ton of expertise on VirtualBox, so we're kind of failing there. But I wanted to quickly circle back to our connection name, right?
Mm-hmm.
So up here in the connection add, I identified the connection name, right? And that's reflected in the nmcli connection output. But this is a place where if you wanted to use a consistent naming function or a consistent naming standard across your boxes so that people could interact with the interfaces without having to know their physical layer connection, you could do that, right? So we could call this a con name Ethernet1, and it would show up in nmcli connection as the word Ethernet1, but the actual device it would be tied to is EMP0S8. And that's important because if you are writing scripts, for example, you're going to run those scripts across like a whole bunch of hosts. Do you really care whether the ETH1 configured, or the first configured Ethernet interface on that box, is plugged into a specific PCI port or has a certain port number on the back of the card, like, should you account for that in your script, or does it not really matter? And so, one of the things I've seen people struggle with over the years is we moved from ETH0 and ETH1 style naming to something more purposeful. And that broke some of the ways that they were used to doing things. So adding a connection name can allow you to reestablish that older method, or more, you can actually assign what names you want on your interfaces, irregardless of what device it's attached to behind the scenes.
Well, and I've seen server grade hardware that's had multiple NIC cards configured on it, and it uses the newer style device naming. But I've seen systems administrators use the more human friendly connection name to specify this is prod one. So this is my primary production network card, and then I've seen additional NICs be labeled as man one, like management one. So for monitoring and some backend services, or storage one if you're using some kind of a network attached storage array. So it really gives you a little bit more flexibility. So for those of us that remember the ETH0, ETH1 days, it's a little bit of retraining your muscle memory, but I think this newer system gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of being able to make more advanced network configurations, but also not break your system, or like Scott said, even break some of your scripted automations. So, almost as if we planned this, our second NIC card is not getting a DHCP address. So one of the ways we might troubleshoot that, or one of the ways we might work around being an environment where there isn't a DHCP server, a lot of DMZs, so web-facing servers rely on static IP addresses to ensure that the web server and a backend database don't lose connection. So this is actually more of a real live scenario than we gave ourselves credit for. So why don't we switch this NIC card over to a static configuration? We'll give it an IP address directly.
Okay, and before we do that, it might be worthwhile to just kind of look at the configuration parameters on this
Sure.
connection.
Is that a device show, I think, or an nmcli DSH for all the eighth doctors out there? That
I went the connection route. You can really choose which direction you want. So you can either deal with things by their connection name, or you can deal with things by their device name. And either way, it'll get you, with the right arguments, probably where you want to go. All right, so there's a ton of settings available for network interfaces, but the ones that we're going to be interested in today is, if I can get my mouse to work correctly. Oop, that one. All right, so this is how we're getting our IP address assignment. So currently it's set to auto, which means DHCP. Down a little bit further, we can see some of the individual parameters that one might want to set, like what DNS settings does it get, or what IP addresses are assigned, or what default gateway is assigned. So these are the parameters that we would want to set in order to get our static configuration correct. And then if we keep going, you'll see there's a whole bunch of IPv6 related assignment stuff as well. And then there's some proxy stuff at the very bottom, which I don't use. All right, so you're ready to make a static address assignment, Mr. Eric?
Yeah. Yeah, let's go ahead and do a connection modify. So our nmcli command, con modify. And then we're going to give either the connection name or the device name. And then we're going to give it a static IPv4 address. So that's your typical 192 style connection. So IPv4.method. And then we're going to switch. You noticed in Scott's output that it was set to auto. So now we want to set it to manual, which implies a static IP address. So we're going to give it an address within the 192 space, and then probably does it need a net mask, or is it going to assume that from the IP address?
Question. Why don't we look after the fact and we can answer our own question?
Let's do it.
But we probably need to assign some things like the default gateway and maybe a DNS server. I don't know.
Maybe. Although, does that network space exist on your network? Because that may not work anyway.
We will see.
We're live. What could possibly go wrong?
Exactly. Sorry, that's not one. And then,
So, for those newer to networking, your IP address is your local system address. Your default gateway is typically the switch or router that sits in front of your server. And then, do you have gateway in there twice?
oh, I do. Yes, I wanted DNS for the second one. Sorry. Good catch.
Hey, that's what I'm here for. So then our DNS would obviously point to a DNS server. And then we're going to try and go without a subnet mask and see if nmcli is smart enough to figure that out without. So if we do a connection show again on our second NIC here, let's see what it figured out.
Yeah, the first thing we want to look at.
Is that on the second page?
It is.
There it is.
So we can see that the IPv4 went to manual, just like we asked. That's good. It set the IPv4 DNS to the DNS server I specified. It set the gateway, and then it's assigned the address to be a 32-bit net mask. So maybe we change it to 24.
Right. Yeah, that's what I would have expected.
So here, let's go back and grab our con modify. And
we'll have some resources in the show notes explaining what how IPv4 works and what subnet masks are. This is a little out of scope, and we only have 30 minutes, so.
All right, so let's see if that worked a little bit better. Oh, there we go.
Awesome.
Right, so. All right, so at this point, we've got our second interface configured statically. And Eric, remind me, what was the command we could look at outside of nmcli to look at our configured IP settings?
So one of the other tools in your toolbox needs to be the IP command. So if you do an IP adder, ADDR, it'll actually print out the output for all of our devices.
And because 8th Doctor loves to make things shorter, turns out there's an abbreviation for that as well. A.
Let's see. Right, so 0S8 does show. Oh, it still shows a /32. That's interesting.
Oh, we may need to reload the network interface.
Right. So how would one go about recycling our network connection?
Well, we could restart the network manager service.
So, harkening back to our system, our services episode, we'd use a systemctl restart, and I think it's capital N network and then manager with capital M. There we go. No news is good news. So let's look at IPA again.
Oh, still showing as 32. Maybe we need to do something else. This is what happens when you don't practice, folks. You run into unexpected things.
What if we down the interface and brought it back up? That was a command we teased earlier anyway. It's ENP0S8, I think. Successfully activated.
And then how do we turn it back on, Eric?
IF up. But Shana2 also points out that you can do an nmcli down and an nmcli up, so you can kind of get the same place a couple of different ways. And it is now /24. Hey, there we go. So, as you can see, there's a couple of troubleshooting steps there. So if you're working on a configuration, or maybe an MCLI off, Shana2 will get back to us here in a second. So networking is one of those spaces where you just have to troubleshoot. And over the last few years, there's been some updates to the networking stack. Network Manager came onto the scene. The old IF config, IF up and down are part of an older stack. nmcli is kind of more the way things are going. If you look at episode 10, we cover the web console. There's a lot of configuration options available for networking. So now I'm curious to find out, because VirtualBox does have that bridge network interface. So I'm curious if maybe the two ports are able to talk to each other. So if we do, so one of the easiest tools you can use to troubleshoot is the ping command.
So I know that I don't want to go down the rat hole of VirtualBox networking this morning.
Right.
But if you want to cover, I think this box is network connected. Let's see.
Okay, we can use a...
It is not network connected.
We will just rename this episode into network troubleshooting.
Right, right. But we can ping ourselves. How about that?
Yeah, let's do that. So we can run the ping command. We can ping our own IP address, as well as others on the network, assuming that the virtual machine is actually connected to said network. And this command will run forever. So one of the things that is helpful to know is if you use a Control-C, you can exit out of that. But something I actually picked up a little bit more recently was you can do a ping-C and then specify the number of packets. So if you're a Hunt for Red October fan, you can send one ping only, and then send that ping to the specific IP address.
And Eric, I'll see your -C and raise you one other thing, which is I believe it's a cap W. So this is the wait time on those pings. So if you don't tell it, it'll wait for some period of time. I don't remember what it is, but it's probably too long. So you can set in seconds what your wait time should be. And if it exceeds your wait time, then it'll just skip and move to the next thing. That's really handy for troubleshoot or for scripting, where you don't want to have your script just take forever because some IP address that may or may not be out there is not available.
Imagine you'd be able to use that for waiting for a host to come back up from a reboot or something.
Yeah, I used to use it a lot when I was in the Red Hat training and certification team, because I'd have to like poll our network of boxes for class to see what was or wasn't out there and what had or had not come back from a reboot. So rather than just have it hang up on a box that may be rebooting, it would just time out after a second and then report that the host was unreachable.
That's awesome. I actually hadn't used -W. I could see that being helpful on a slower network connection, or if you've got a box remotely that may be experiencing some lag, you could give that box a little bit more of a grace period to respond back. So I haven't used this next command very often, but you want to talk to us about MTR?
Yeah, so MTR, I put that in here because this is one of my favorites. So this is not going to be a very interesting MTR output because our box can't go anywhere. But what it does, well, okay, never mind. It is going places. So what it's doing is it is sending out a series of trace routes. So there's another command called traceroute that will send out a series of expired pings. The difference between traceroute and MTR is MTR continually sends that traceroute. whereas traceroute will send it once all the way through, or maybe 3 times all the way through, and then exits. And what's interesting is um, you can see the packet statistics for each hop. And if one of these hops is refusing your traffic or dropping your traffic, it will bold. And then you'll see that loss percentage start to go up as you send more and more traffic. So I find it really handy to troubleshoot where on the network I'm having problems. One example is, well, you can see right there, 4.68.62.255 is starting to drop my traffic. But one place where this is handy is like if I'm having internet service provider problems. Internet service providers these days are fairly complex, right? There's a lot of different gateways and stuff that they go through. So everything might look fine in your house or on your street or in your neighborhood, but then when your stuff gets routed to Kansas City, let's say, uh, the Eric has broken all the things. So
It was me. I'm
you'll
sorry.
see like, yeah, you'll see where your problem is, and um, depending on your ISP, like I've had varying levels of success at this, where I can call my um, customer service and be like, "Hey, look, here is the machine that is causing me problems," and give them the IP address of the machine that's causing you problems. And sometimes they'll transfer you to someone that can actually affect a change there.
I can think of any number of situations as a systems administrator where this would have been hugely helpful.
Yeah, well, and for me, like in my spare time when I do that other volunteer activity, um, people will stop by my desk and go, "The Wi-Fi's down," and it's like, no, actually, it's not. The Wi-Fi in our building is 100% operational. It is our internet service provider, and let me tell you exactly where they're having problems. Um, so
This is great. We're actually going to cover traceroute as well in a future episode, but this may replace traceroute as kind of my go-to of what part of my internet is broken. Um, is there anything else we want to cover today? I think we'll wait on dig, but
so I figured out why it's all busted.
oh yeah,
Yeah. So remember earlier in the episode when we set the DNS setting for IPv4?
uh
Well, it
huh.
turns out if we look at the configuration file for that, right, it was set in there. Um, so let's see. Yeah, so there you go. Um, neither one of these name servers is actually responding with DNS names. So that's why our traceroute by IP was working, but our ping by host name, right? When I pinged www.google.com, it didn't work. Let's see if I ping by IP. That works fine. So, uh, we're not able to do DNS lookups, and dig would also fail, but it would give us a similar response about service not being able to be reached. And that would direct our search, right? We should look at our DNS configuration and actually contact those servers to see if they're actually out there serving DNS entries. But we could do a whole episode on network troubleshooting if we wanted to.
We could do an entire episode on the fact that it's not DNS, except it was DNS. Or as I found out over the weekend, I was trying to port forward a Minecraft server here on my home network, only to find out that my router actually has a known bug where the newer router that they sent me actually has a bug in port forwarding. So I spent almost 2 weeks and called in every sysadmin I know to troubleshoot an issue, and come to find out it was the brand new piece of hardware that I was sent by my ISP saying, "Oh, this will work great. It'll give you better throughput and all the things." And oh, but it's got port forwarding broken for the last 2 years. So networking is fun. If you're a systems administrator, make good friends with your networking team, because you will be talking back and forth a lot. Scott, any closing thoughts before we wrap today?
Just that we will continue our daily episodes for what are we down to 2 weeks left, Eric?
Just shy of 2 weeks.
And for those of you who also watch Dark Mode, Eighth Doctor, I will see you tonight at Dark Mode for another pass at networking.
which we learned a lot from this episode, so we'll put that into our show notes for tonight. And join us again tomorrow for another daily episode 12 already, where we're going to be talking about administrative access on our box. We've been using the root account quite liberally, but there's actually more ways to administer your box than just SUing to root. So we'll talk about sudo and esu, and the shadow file, or not the shadow file, but the sudoers file. So join us tomorrow for that. A lot of cool ways to configure your system to make it more secure, but giving your people exactly what they need. Until then, have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.